Two diving enthusiasts are diving into an unknown cave. On the way back, one of their air tanks gets unexpectedly stuck. With no other choice, they are forced to share a single tank. But not only does the air run out quickly, they also swim into a dead end. Later, to recover one of the bodies, a veteran diving instructor heads down into the water himself. But something goes wrong for him too. By the time he returns to the surface, his stomach is bloated like a 9-month pregnant woman about to burst. This is the story of the Jacob's Well cave diving tragedy we are covering today. Located northwest of the small town of Wimberley, Texas, is a natural artesian spring called Jacob's Well. It measures about 12 feet in diameter. From the outside, the water is a deep, vibrant blue. It is crystal clear all the way to the bottom. It looks like the perfect spot for swimming and cliff jumping. But at the bottom, 26 feet down, there is an opening that leads into an unexplored underwater cave. This cave system is primarily made up of 4 chambers. The first chamber is the wellhead you see from the surface. From 26 feet to 55 feet down is the second chamber. The layout here is complex with many side paths. If you aren't careful, it is very easy to get lost. The third chamber, at a depth of 75 feet, gradually narrows. It continues until it meets the junction of the fourth chamber. This is a tight opening known as the birth canal. Loose, collapsing gravel can easily block the passage. Divers usually have to dig a path first, and then remove their tanks just to squeeze through. This is where most of the fatalities at Jacob's Well occur. For example, on September 9, 1979, a group of about 20 people arrived at Jacob's Well at 11:30 p.m. While the others were still resting and getting ready, 3 of them went into the water early for a night dive. They were Kent, Mark, and Joe. All 3 were experienced divers in their early 20s. Kent, in particular, had been diving since he was 12. The reason they chose a night dive is that visibility inside the cave is already very low. It doesn't really matter if it's light or dark outside. Plus, there are no other swimmers to get in their way at night. However, this time, the 3 of them had no backup lights or safety lines. It was a spur-of-the-moment dive. They began their descent slowly from the first chamber. Although the water became murky as they stirred it up, they made it to the third chamber fairly smoothly. At that time, the fourth chamber had never been explored. Some said it was just a dead end. Others said it led to an even larger chamber. Faced with this unknown temptation, whether it was a moment of impulse from Kent, or a long-held plan, without deploying a guideline, Kent didn't hesitate to take off his tank. He backed into the narrow opening feet first. Mark followed Kent's lead and went in after him, witnessing their risky behavior. Joe, who was still in the third chamber, was shocked. Joe quickly swam over, but he didn't follow them in. Instead, he frantically waved his light to try and signal them, but all he saw was Mark slowly disappearing into the darkness. Joe kept trying to signal them in every way he could. With no response and his own air running low, Joe grabbed his dive light and threw it into the passage. He hoped it would help guide them back out. After that, he immediately turned and headed for the surface. During the ascent, Joe already knew in his heart that Kent and Mark likely weren't coming back. Once he reached the surface, Joe told the other divers what happened. He then quickly called the police. A few hours later, a rescue team led by Don Dibble arrived at the scene. Don Dibble was a former Navy diver. Now, he was a veteran cave diving expert and instructor. Don first sent 2 divers down to assess the situation. They found that the passage to the fourth chamber was completely blocked by gravel. Facing this difficult problem, Don decided to dive in himself. On his way down, he left a spare tank at the bottom of the first chamber. He also laid out a safety line along the way. He was accompanied by a partner. As they passed through the third chamber, they specifically checked the ceiling to make sure they didn't miss any floating objects. Upon reaching the entrance to the fourth chamber, they confirmed the opening was indeed blocked by gravel. Don checked his pressure gauge. He saw he had about 10 minutes of air left. So, he decided to try and enter the fourth chamber. He grabbed the safety line, using his body as a wedge. He tried to squeeze his head and shoulders into the gap, but in the next second, more gravel collapsed, pinning his torso and arms tightly. The area was instantly engulfed in a cloud of silt. Because his arms were jammed fast, he couldn't grab the safety line. He couldn't signal his partner either, and his partner couldn't see anything in the murky water. As an experienced expert, Don tried his best to stay calm, but the harder he struggled, the faster his breathing became. Then, something terrifying happened. He took a breath, but the regulator delivered no air. He tried again, and still nothing. Instead, a mouthful of water rushed in. Don realized then that his regulator had failed. His body began to convulse violently. Surprisingly, this struggle freed his arms. Almost at the same time, his partner shoved his own regulator into Don's mouth. Don instinctively began to gasp for air, but this was an extremely dangerous move. Since the air they were sharing was nearly gone, they had to rush to the surface. At 100 feet underwater, The air is compressed to about 4 times atmospheric pressure. As he rose, the air inside him expanded fourfold. By the time he reached the surface, Don's stomach looked like a 9-month pregnancy. He was rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery. During those few minutes of surfacing, the swallowed water and expanding air had caused his stomach to rupture. After being hospitalized, he eventually made a full recovery. It was a miracle he survived. While he was in the hospital, other divers still tried to recover the bodies of Kent and Mark, but due to the extreme difficulty and the costs, the recovery efforts were eventually called off. To prevent anyone else from getting into trouble, with the family's permission, Don sealed the opening with a metal grate. Kent and Mark were left inside forever. It seemed like the story of the 4th chamber was over, but Don underestimated the determination of cave diving enthusiasts. Just a few months later, the grate was torn off. There was even a plastic sign left behind that said, "You can't keep us out." This indirectly led to the next tragedy. 4 years after Kent and Mark died, 2 members of an advanced diving class at Texas State University, Richard and Clark, decided to try and enter the 4th chamber. As it happened, these 2 young men were Don's students. Even though Don had warned them countless times about the dangers, it only made them more curious. But the problem was, the 2 of them only had extensive experience in open water diving. They had 0 experience in cave diving. They didn't know to bring a safety line to mark their path. They didn't know how to use frog kicks to avoid stirring up silt. The biggest difference is, in open water, you can follow bubbles safely to the surface. But that approach is incredibly dangerous in a cave. At 8:30 p.m. on November 23, 1983, Richard and Clark dove into Jacob's Well, feeling both nervous and excited. They made it through the first few chambers smoothly. They reached the entrance to the 4th chamber that Don had warned them about. Fortunately, the gravel in the opening had been washed away by the current. Seeing this, the 2 became even more excited. They seemed to think it was a sign from above, so they decided to go in and explore. Because the opening was so narrow, they had to take off their tanks, just to push them through and squeeze in. Richard squeezed into the tunnel first. Clark waited outside. Once Richard was through, Clark started taking off his tank to follow. But as he approached the opening, Richard's face suddenly appeared back at the opening. He looked panicked and in extreme pain. He didn't care that his body was being scraped raw by the rocks. Seeing this, Clark realized what was wrong. Richard didn't have his air tank. He was suffocating. It turns out Richard's tank had been damaged by rocks inside. He had to turn back to find Clark. Clark immediately shoved his regulator into Richard's mouth. Just like Don's experience years before, the 2 began taking turns breathing from one regulator. Since they knew what happened to Don, they didn't dare surface too quickly, but this meant their air wouldn't last. They managed to follow the cave wall back to the 2nd chamber. Even though they had no guideline or light, they thought they were almost out and didn't panic too much. But a moment later, there was a loud clank above their heads. Their tanks had hit the ceiling of the chamber. As mentioned before, the 2nd chamber is the most complicated one. The exit path has 2 very similar looking passages. One is the correct path to the 1st chamber. The other is a dead end called the false chimney. To make matters worse, their tanks were now ringing hollow. That meant they were completely out of air. Realizing the situation, Clark didn't hesitate. He signaled Richard to follow him. He kicked off the wall and swam 20 feet back to the correct passage. Then he made a dash for the 1st chamber. He pushed himself to swim another 40 feet up. Finally, he broke the surface and gasped for air. But he felt no relief. He realized Richard hadn't followed him out. After waiting a moment, Clark knew it was too late. After calling for help, Don Dibble arrived within the hour. Don was shocked and devastated to find out it was his own students. He felt completely helpless. Because the cave was filled with silt, they had to wait until the next day to start the recovery. The next day, Don went down himself to recover Richard's body. Sure enough, he found Richard floating at the top of the false chimney. Maybe visibility was too low to see the signal, or maybe he just didn't understand what Clark meant. Either way, Richard didn't follow and ended up drowning. He was literally trapped in the water until he ran out of breath, despite all of Don Dibble's warnings, and the physical barriers he put up. But this wouldn't be the last tragedy at Jacob's Well. In 1984, another 3-person team planned a groundbreaking exploration of the well. This time, they were well-equipped and fully prepared. They laid a guideline all the way from the 1st to the 4th chamber. One member, Danny, found the tanks left behind by Kent and Mark. He also took detailed measurements of the 4th chamber. The other 2, John and Wayne, even pushed through the 5th chamber into the 6th. They said the 5th chamber was extremely tight. The space was more like a long tunnel, even more cramped than the entrance to the 4th. But the 6th chamber opened up significantly. However, because of the low visibility, they couldn't tell exactly how big it was. Even today, there are no public maps of the 6th chamber. Unfortunately, on the way out, Wayne, who was at the back, got stuck in the narrow 5th chamber. He ultimately lost his life. Fast forward to 1991, another group of divers was exploring the fourth chamber. At the very top, they accidentally found Mark's gear and some of his remains. Kent wasn't found until the year 2000. During a geological mapping project, workers stumbled upon his remains near the entrance to the fifth chamber. This showed that Kent had actually made it quite far during the original accident. As for why the 1984 team didn't find him, it might have been the low visibility from the silt they stirred up, or maybe his remains were buried under gravel, leaving only his tank visible at the time. Regardless, the tragedy of 1979 finally came to a close 21 years later. To date, there are 8 documented deaths at Jacob's Well, but estimates suggest the actual number is likely over 12. In the end, Don finally got his wish. The entrance to the second chamber is now sealed with a grate. Combined with the drop in water levels due to aquifer damage, all diving activities are now strictly prohibited. Alright, that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.